In the mist-shrouded valleys of central Japan, on a rain-soaked morning in October 1600, two massive armies faced each other across a narrow plain that would determine the fate of an entire nation. This was no ordinary battle between rival nations of decades of civil war, political warlords. This was the culmination scheming and ruthless ambition. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, a master strategist who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. On the other, Ishida Mitsunari led a coalition of lords determined to preserve the legacy of Japan's greatest unifier. What happened next would end the age of endless warfare and forge a dynasty that would rule Japan for over 2.5 centuries. This is the story of Sekigahara, the gamble that united all of Japan. The year 1598 marked the end of an era. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant who had risen to become Japan's supreme ruler, lay dying in his magnificent castle at Osaka. For the first time in decades, the archipelago faced the prospect of unified leadership slipping away. Hideyoshi had achieved what seemed impossible, bringing the warring provinces under his banner through a combination of military genius and political cunning. Yet as his strength faded, the great unifier confronted a problem that had plagued rulers throughout history. His heir, Hideyori, was only 6 years old, far too young to command the loyalty of battle-hardened generals who had carved their domains from blood and steel. Recognizing the precarious nature of his legacy, Hideyoshi established a council of 5 regents to govern in his young son's name. These 5 men, known as the Teiro, were among the most powerful daimyo in Japan: Maeda Toshie, Mori Teramoto, Ukita Hidei, Uesugi Kagekatsu, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each commanded vast armies and controlled territories that could sustain years of warfare. The system was designed to prevent any single lord from seizing power, but it was built on a foundation of mutual distrust and barely contained ambition. Among these 5 regents, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood apart. While his colleagues had grown comfortable in their wealth and status, Ieyasu possessed something far more dangerous: patience honed by a lifetime of strategic thinking. His childhood had been marked by hardship and uncertainty. As a young boy, he had been held hostage by rival clans, learning valuable lessons about survival, negotiation, and the art of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. These early experiences had forged him into a different kind of leader, one who understood that true power came not from immediate gratification, but from careful preparation and timing. The death of Hideyoshi in September 1598 shattered the delicate balance of the regency almost immediately. Within months, the careful structure began to crumble as old rivalries resurfaced and new ambitions emerged. Ieyasu moved quickly to consolidate his position, relocating to Fushimi Castle in Kyoto and approving strategic marriages between his clan and neighboring domains. To his fellow regents and many other daimyo, these actions appeared to be the opening moves in a bid for supreme power. The situation deteriorated further in 1599 with the death of Maeda Toshie, who had served as a moderating influence among the regents. With Toshie gone, there was no one left who could effectively mediate between the competing factions. The regency system, already strained by personal animosities and conflicting interests, began to split into 2 hostile camps. On one side gathered those who remained loyal to the Toyotomi legacy and viewed Ieyasu's growing influence with alarm. Leading this faction was Ishida Mitsunari, a man whose background could not have been more different from Ieyasu's. Where Ieyasu was a seasoned warrior who had spent decades on battlefields, Mitsunari was primarily an administrator, a master of logistics and financial management who had won Hideyoshi's favor through his exceptional organizational skills and devotion to the tea ceremony. His loyalty to the Toyotomi cause was absolute, but his lack of military experience would prove to be a critical weakness in the trials ahead. Mitsunari's supporters included 3 of the remaining regents. Mori Teramoto controlled vast territories in western Japan and commanded the nominal leadership of what would become known as the Western Army. Ukita Hidei brought his own forces and the legitimacy of his position as one of Hideyoshi's chosen regents. Uesugi Kagekatsu controlled domains in northern Japan, adding geographic diversity to the anti-Tokugawa coalition. Together they represented a formidable alliance, but one that was held together more by shared opposition to Ieyasu than by genuine unity of purpose. The geographic divisions of these alliances were not accidental. Ieyasu's power base lay primarily in eastern Japan, where his domains provided him with vast resources and a network of loyal vassals who had served the Tokugawa clan for generations. His supporters, who would form the Eastern Army, included many daimyo who had grown wealthy and powerful under his patronage. They understood that their continued prosperity depended on Ieyasu's success, creating bonds of mutual interest that went far deeper than mere feudal obligation. The Western Army, by contrast, drew its strength from the established lords of Western and Southern Japan, many of whom had been prominent under Hideyoshi's rule. Their motivations were more complex and sometimes contradictory. Some genuinely believed in preserving the Toyotomi legacy for young Hideyori. Others saw an opportunity to prevent Ieyasu from becoming too powerful. Still, others harbored personal grudges or sought to protect their own domains from Tokugawa expansion. This diversity of motivations would prove to be both a strength and a fatal weakness when the moment of truth arrived. As tensions escalated throughout 1599 and early 1600, both sides engaged in an elaborate dance of political maneuvering. Secret negotiations were conducted, alliances were forged and broken, and spies moved freely between the opposing camps. Ieyasu demonstrated his mastery of this shadow war, using his vast intelligence network to stay informed of his enemies' plans while spreading disinformation to sow confusion among their ranks. His agents worked tirelessly to identify potential defectors within the Western Army, offering rewards for loyalty and exploiting existing grievances against Mitsunari's leadership. The breaking point came in the summer of 1600. Ieyasu had been drawn away from the capital to deal with a potential threat from the Uesugi clan in the north, providing Mitsunari with what appeared to be a perfect opportunity to strike. The Western Army leaders called their allies to arms, planning a coordinated attack that would catch Ieyasu's forces divided and vulnerable. It was a sound strategy in theory, but it failed to account for Ieyasu's superior intelligence network and his ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Rather than being caught off guard, Ieyasu had anticipated this move. His network of spies had kept him informed of the Western Army's preparations, allowing him to prepare countermeasures well in advance. When Mitsunari's forces began to move, Ieyasu was ready with a response that would demonstrate his tactical brilliance and strategic vision. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would determine not just the immediate question of political control, but the entire future direction of Japanese civilization. Two armies, representing different visions of Japan's destiny, began their march toward a small village called Sekigahara, where the narrow mountain passes would force them into a battle that neither could avoid. The greatest gamble in Japanese history was about to begin. The campaign that followed would showcase Ieyasu's mastery of deception and rapid movement. While Mitsunari believed he had cornered his rival in the distant northern provinces, Ieyasu executed a brilliant feint that left his enemies scrambling to respond. Instead of becoming bogged down in a prolonged campaign against the Uesugi clan, he quickly resolved the northern threat through negotiation and intimidation, then pivoted his entire army westward with stunning speed. The key to Ieyasu's strategy lay in controlling the vital highways that connected eastern and western Japan. The Tokaido and Nakasendō roads were the arteries through which armies, supplies, and information flowed across the archipelago. By seizing strategic castles along these routes, Ieyasu could effectively cut off his enemy's lines of communication while securing his own supply lines for the decisive confrontation ahead. His first major success came with the capture of Gifu Castle, a fortress that commanded a crucial position along the Nakasendō road. The castle's fall sent shockwaves through the Western Army, demonstrating that Ieyasu's forces were not trapped in the north as they had believed, but were instead advancing rapidly toward the heartland of Japan. The psychological impact was as important as the strategic advantage, as wavering daimyo began to question whether they had chosen the winning side. Meanwhile, Mitsunari found himself caught between competing pressures and conflicting information. His spies reported that Ieyasu's next target might be Sawayama Castle, Mitsunari's own stronghold, which would leave the path open for a Tokugawa march on Kyoto and Osaka. The prospect of losing the capital and failing to protect young Hideyori filled Mitsunari with dread. Every hour of delay increased the risk that Ieyasu would outmaneuver him completely, yet rushing into battle without proper coordination could prove equally disastrous. The rain that began falling on the evening of October 20th added another layer of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. Both armies were forced to march through the darkness, their movements hampered by mud and limited visibility. Soldiers struggled to keep their equipment dry while maintaining formation in the treacherous conditions. The weather seemed to mirror the murky political situation, where loyalties shifted like shadows and the outcome remained impossible to predict. As dawn approached on October 21st, the two armies converged on the small village of Sekigahara. The location was not chosen by chance or accident. This narrow valley, surrounded by hills and bisected by the Nakasendō road, represented a natural bottleneck where Japan's destiny would be decided. The Western Army, despite arriving first, found themselves in the tactically inferior position. Their forces were spread across multiple hills, making coordination difficult and leaving them vulnerable to the kind of concentrated assault that Ieyasu excelled at delivering. The fog that shrouded the battlefield at first light seemed to hold the breath of history itself. Through the mist, over 160,000 samurai prepared for what they knew would be the defining battle of their age. The Eastern Army, numbering approximately 80,000 men, took up positions in the valley floor, their formations tight and disciplined. Facing them across the narrow plain, the Western Army's 80,000 warriors occupied the surrounding heights, their banners barely visible through the swirling vapor. Among the Western Army's commanders, doubts had been growing for weeks. Many had agreed to support Mitsunari reluctantly, motivated more by fear of Tokugawa dominance than by genuine enthusiasm for the cause. Some harbored deep personal resentments against Mitsunari himself, viewing him as an upstart administrator who lacked the military credentials to lead seasoned warriors into battle. These underlying tensions would prove crucial as the morning progressed. Ieyasu, positioned with his reserves behind the main battle line, surveyed the scene with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades preparing for this moment. His intelligence network had provided him with detailed information about the Western Army's positions and, more importantly, about the secret negotiations that had been conducted with several key commanders. The seeds of betrayal had already been planted, requiring only the right moment to bloom into decisive action. The thick fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full scope of the forces arrayed across the battlefield. Banners fluttered in the morning breeze, displaying the mon of dozens of great clans whose ancestors had fought each other for centuries. Today, old alliances would be tested, and new ones forged in blood and steel. The age of the warring states was about to reach its final devastating climax. When the first war cries echoed across the valley, they carried with them the weight of Japan's entire future. This was more than a battle between rival armies. It was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of what the nation could become. On one side stood those who sought to preserve the complex web of competing loyalties that had defined the Sengoku period. On the other, marched those who believed that only unified command under a single, unchallenged authority could bring lasting peace to the blood-soaked islands. The opening moves of the battle would reveal just how carefully Ieyasu had prepared for this moment, and how thoroughly he understood not just the art of war, but the deeper currents of human nature that would ultimately determine victory or defeat. As the morning mist began to dissipate, revealing the full magnitude of the forces gathered at Sekigahara, the first shots of the battle rang out across the valley. It was Naomasa, one of Ieyasu's most trusted retainers, who fired the opening volley. His red-armored cavalry, known throughout Japan for their fierce reputation, charged forward without waiting for orders, striking directly at the heart of Ukita Hide's formation on the Western Army's front line. The breach of protocol was deliberate. Naomasa understood that in a battle of this magnitude, seizing the initiative could prove decisive. His unauthorized attack sent ripples of confusion through both armies as commanders struggled to adapt their carefully laid plans to the sudden eruption of violence. The thunder of hooves mixed with the crash of steel as his cavalry smashed into the western lines, their crimson banners cutting through the grey morning like streaks of blood. Across the battlefield, the sound of arquebus fire began to crackle like breaking wood. The Portuguese weapons, introduced to Japan decades earlier, had revolutionized warfare on the islands. Volleys of lead balls tore through the ranks of advancing samurai, their armor offering little protection against the devastating power of gunpowder. The acrid smoke of burning powder mixed with the fog, creating an eerie twilight that obscured friend from foe. From his command position, Ieyasu watched the opening exchanges with the practiced eye of a veteran who had witnessed dozens of battles. He could see immediately that his gamble was paying off. The Western Army's response to Naomasa's assault was disjointed and hesitant, revealing the underlying tensions within Mitsunari's coalition. Units that should have moved in coordinated support instead hesitated, waiting for orders that came too slowly or not at all. The center of the battlefield erupted into a maelstrom of violence as more Eastern Army units joined the assault. Fukushima Masanori, despite his initial anger at being upstaged by Naomasa, threw his forces forward with typical ferocity. His men, veterans of Hideyoshi's Korean campaigns, fought with the disciplined fury of professional soldiers who understood that their lord's fortunes depended on victory here. Their battle cries echoed off the surrounding hills as they carved deep into the Western formations. Yet for all the sound and fury of the initial assault, the battle remained far from decided. The Western Army's numerical strength and superior positioning allowed them to absorb the Eastern attack without breaking. Yukita Hideyi's forces, though pressed hard, maintained their cohesion and fought back with desperate courage. These men knew that defeat would mean not just death, but the complete destruction of everything they had fought to preserve. As the morning wore on, the battle settled into a grinding contest of attrition. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage through force of arms alone. The narrow confines of the valley prevented either army from bringing its full strength to bear, while the complex terrain made coordinated movements nearly impossible. Individual units fought isolated battles within the larger conflict, their struggles often invisible to the commanders who sought to direct the overall flow of combat. It was during this period of apparent stalemate that the true nature of Ieyasu's strategy began to reveal itself. The secret negotiations that had occupied months of preparation were about to bear fruit in the most spectacular fashion. High on Mount Matsuo, overlooking the main battlefield, Kobayakawa Hideaki sat motionless with his 15,000 warriors. The young lord had been positioned to deliver a crushing blow against the Eastern Army's flank, but as the hours passed, his forces remained frozen in place. The sight of Kobayakawa's inaction sent waves of uncertainty through the Western ranks. Commanders who had counted on his support began to question whether their carefully coordinated battle plan was falling apart. Messengers rode frantically between the scattered formations, carrying increasingly desperate orders that often contradicted each other. As the Western Army's command structure began to fracture under pressure, Mitsunari himself recognized the growing crisis. From his position near the center of the Western line, he could see that his army's morale was beginning to waver. The prolonged fighting had taken its toll, and the failure of key units to engage was sowing confusion throughout his forces. At 11 o'clock, he made the fateful decision to fire a signal flare, the predetermined command for an all-out assault that would either secure victory or result in catastrophic defeat. The rocket arced high into the gray sky, its brilliant flash visible across the entire battlefield. This was the moment that should have marked the turning point in favor of the Western Army, as fresh formations swept down from the hills to overwhelm the Eastern forces in the valley below. Instead, it became the signal for betrayal on a scale that would echo through Japanese history. Kobayakawa Hideaki, who had spent the morning in apparent indecision, suddenly spurred his horse forward. But instead of attacking the Eastern Army as planned, his forces charged down the mountainside toward their former allies. The sight of 15,000 warriors bearing down on them sent shockwaves through the Western formations. Units that had been preparing to advance suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against men they had trusted with their backs. The betrayal created a domino effect that spread across the battlefield like wildfire. Other Western commanders who had been secretly negotiating with Ieyasu saw their opportunity and seized it. Kikawa Hiroi, commanding a crucial sector of the Mori forces, refused to advance when ordered, effectively removing 20,000 men from the battle at the moment when their support was most desperately needed. The carefully constructed Western coalition began to disintegrate as unit after unit either defected or simply withdrew from the fighting. From his command post, Ieyasu observed the collapse of enemy resistance with grim satisfaction. This was the culmination of months of patient work, turning his enemy's own allies against them through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and political manipulation. The Battle of Sekigahara was being won, not through superior tactics or martial prowess, but through the methodical corruption of his opponent's support base. The psychological impact of the mass defections proved as devastating as their military consequences. Western army units that had been fighting courageously suddenly found themselves isolated and surrounded. Morale collapsed as word spread that their own allies had turned against them. Some formations attempted to retreat in good order, while others simply dissolved as individual samurai fled the field or switched sides to save their own lives. Mitsunari, witnessing the destruction of everything he had worked to build, made one final desperate attempt to rally his forces. Gathering the remnants of his personal retainers, he launched a direct assault on Ieyasu's command position, hoping that a successful strike against the enemy leader might still salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. It was a move born of desperation rather than strategy, but it demonstrated the unwavering loyalty that had made him Hideyoshi's most trusted administrator. The charge was doomed from the start. Ieyasu's guards, elite warriors who had protected their lord through decades of conflict, formed an impenetrable wall of steel around their master. Mitsunari's small force was quickly overwhelmed, though the man himself managed to escape into the mountains as his dream of preserving the Toyotomi legacy crumbled around him. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Battle of Sekigahara was effectively over. What had begun as one of the largest military engagements in Japanese history had ended in complete victory for the Eastern Army. The field was littered with the bodies of those who had remained loyal to the Western cause, while thousands more had been captured or had fled into the surrounding countryside. The speed and totality of the collapse stunned even Ieyasu's supporters. In the span of a few hours, the political landscape of Japan had been completely transformed. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that had defined the Sengoku period lay in ruins, replaced by the stark reality of Tokugawa dominance. The aged not with a gradual consoli of the warring states had endation of power, but with a single, decisive stroke that left no room for doubt about who would rule Japan. As the smoke cleared and the cries of the wounded echoed across the valley, it became clear that this battle had achieved something that centuries of warfare had failed to accomplish. For the first time in living memory, Japan faced the prospect of genuine unification under a single, unchallenged authority. The gamble that Ieyasu had been preparing for his entire life had paid off beyond his wildest expectations. The immediate aftermath of the battle would prove as crucial as the fighting itself, as the new master of Japan moved quickly to consolidate his victory and establish the foundations of a dynasty that would endure for centuries to come. Within hours of his triumph, Ieyasu demonstrated the calculated ruthlessness that had brought him to power. The pursuit of fleeing Western Army remnants continued long after the formal battle had ended, as Easterglers through army cavalry hunted down the mountain passes and forest paths surrounding Sekigahara. There would be no mercy for those who had dared to oppose the new order, no sanctuary for the defeated champions of a dying cause. The capture of Ishida Mitsunari, 3 days after the battle, marked the symbolic end of resistance to Tokugawa rule. The man who had orchestrated the grand coalition against Ieyasu was discovered hiding in a mountain temple, his dreams of preserving Hideyoshi's legacy reduced to ash and memory. His execution in Kyoto would serve as a stark reminder to any who might consider future rebellion. The loyal administrator who had served his master with unwavering devotion paid the ultimate price for his principles. Yet Ieyasu understood that true conquest required more than military victory. The redistribution of domains that followed Sekigahara revealed the depth of his political genius. Over 6 million koku worth of land changed hands as the new shogun rewarded his supporters and punished his enemies with surgical precision. Those who had remained neutral found their territories reduced, while those who had actively supported the Western Army faced complete dispossession. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty to the Tokugawa would be rewarded, but opposition would be crushed without mercy. The speed with which major strongholds fell to Ieyasu's forces demonstrated the psychological impact of Sekigahara. Sawayama Castle, Mitsunari's own fortress, surrendered within days. Osaka Castle, the magnificent seat of Toyotomi power, opened its gates without resistance. The great daimyo who had seemed so formidable just weeks earlier now competed to demonstrate their submission to the new master of Japan. The complex web of alliances that had sustained decades of warfare dissolved overnight, replaced by the simple reality of Tokugawa dominance. Among those who benefited most from the post-battle redistribution were the turncoat commanders whose betrayal had secured victory. Kobayakawa Hideaki, despite his hesitation during the actual fighting, received substantial rewards for his eventual defection. The message to future generations of ambitious lords was clear: those who recognized the inevitable direction of history and positioned themselves accordingly would prosper under Tokugawa rule. Pragmatism trumped loyalty in the new order that was emerging from the ashes of the old. The gamble that began in the mist-shrouded valleys of Sekigahara had transformed Japan forever. In a single morning, Tokugawa Ieyasu had achieved what centuries of warfare could not: the complete unification of a fractured nation under one unchallenged ruler. His victory was built not just on military might, but on the patient cultivation of human weakness and ambition. The Tokugawa shogunate that emerged from this triumph would bring Japan over 2.5 centuries of peace, stability, and isolation from the outside world. From the ashes of the Warring States period rose a new Japan, one where the sword would finally be sheathed and the long nightmare of endless civil war would become nothing more than memory. Sekigahara proved that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on the battlefield, but in the shadows where loyalty is bought and betrayal is carefully orchestrated. The last great gamble of feudal Japan had paid off, and a dynasty was born that would endure until the modern age.